What if the world isn't failing, just overlapping? It begins the way so many modern mysteries begin, not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet inconsistency, a porch light that turns on when no one is home, the faint smell of something cooking in a kitchen that should be cold, a television murmuring in an empty living room, the sound seeping through drywall like a memory trying to remember itself. Most of us learn early to trust the sturdy parts of life. Streets stay where they are. Houses don't change owners twice in the same night. Time moves forward with the patient confidence of gravity. We build our days around that reliability. We plan birthdays. We grieve funerals. We sign mortgages and promise ourselves the future will behave. And then, in scattered places, remote trails and downtown blocks, suburban neighborhoods and research labs, something happens that doesn't fit. Not a ghost story, exactly. Not a conspiracy, not a warning, not a prophecy. Just a seam in the ordinary fabric that briefly loosens, letting a different thread show through. In Salem, Oregon, there is a house that seems to live two lives. The kind of house you could pass without looking twice. A yard, a driveway, windows that catch the late afternoon sun. The family inside has their own routines, their own arguments over dishes and homework. But on certain nights, with no warning and no pattern anyone can agree on, the house appears to shift, subtly like a photograph changing exposure. And for a handful of hours, another family seems to be there instead, moving through the same rooms as if time never took them away. In Washington's Olympic Forest, hikers have walked a trail and met someone who looks exactly like them. Same face, same posture, but wearing different clothes, carrying knowledge that hasn't happened yet. In Prague, visitors have stepped from the modern city into an older version of it, a living medieval street scene that doesn't feel staged. In Minnesota, a city sometimes presents an alternate map of itself, streets and buildings that history in our world erased, standing stubbornly intact. Then there are places where the laws themselves feel negotiable, a zone in the Rockies where gravity appears to pull the wrong way, a town where chance behaves like a mischievous composer, repeating rare notes until they become a chorus. Buildings that seem to breathe, as if architecture has borrowed the logic of biology. A laboratory where emotions are not private weather, but measurable forces, anger heating the air, fear scrambling machines, joy lightening the weight of things. Each story on its own sounds like an outlier, the kind of tale you could dismiss as rumor, misinterpretation, or wishful thinking. But taken together, they form a pattern that's harder to ignore. Not because it proves anything beyond doubt, but because it keeps pointing to the same unsettling possibility that our reality might not be a single, sealed container. Maybe it's more like a shoreline. When you stand at the edge of the ocean, the boundary between land and water is clear, until it isn't. The tide arrives quietly, changing what belongs where. A wave reaches further than the last. And for a moment, the world is not one thing or another, but both. Sand and sea intermingled, each reshaping the other. If there are other versions of existence, other histories, other outcomes, other laws, then perhaps we sometimes live close enough to them to feel their spray. A life where the accident didn't happen. A future that has already begun to cast a shadow backward. A universe where matter listens more closely to mind. The question is not whether these stories are comforting or frightening. The question is what they reveal about how fragile our certainty really is. If reality can overlap, even briefly, what else do we take for granted? And if these are only glimpses, thin moments where the barrier weakens, what does it mean that we are noticing them more now. Somewhere, in a quiet neighborhood or a stretch of forest, the world may be preparing another small contradiction. Another light in an empty house. Another voice where there should be silence. And the mystery, as always, won't begin with an explosion. It will begin with someone saying softly, "That shouldn't be possible." What if a home could remember a life that never ended? On certain winter evenings in Salem, Oregon, the streetlights blink on with the soft patience of routine. Tires whisper over wet asphalt. A dog barks once, then settles. And at 1247 Maple Street, a familiar-looking house sometimes behaves like a doorway someone forgot to lock. The neighbors noticed it first, the way neighbors always do, a glow in the windows when the family was supposed to be away. A porch light that stayed on too long. Movement behind curtains during a weekend when the driveway sat empty. At first, it felt like the harmless confusion of modern life. Someone left a lamp on, a house sitter arrived early, a teenager snuck home. But then the details piled up in a shape that refused to be ordinary. Police knocked on the front door. No answer. They entered to do what they are trained to do: clear rooms, check corners, ensure safety. The house was silent, empty. Yet the air held warmth, the kind you feel after cooking. A faint smell of food lingered like an unfinished sentence. The television, in some reports, was on, murmuring into a room that contained no one. Beds looked disturbed, not messy, but slept in. And the strangest part was how quickly the normal explanations ran out. When the current owners, Mark and Linda Jameson, began installing security cameras, they weren't chasing a ghost. They were chasing certainty. They wanted proof that they weren't losing their minds. They wanted to catch a trespasser, a neighbor's prank, a wiring problem, anything that would fit. The footage did fit something, just not the world Mark and Linda thought they lived in. On the screen, the house filled with people who had no right to be there, except that they belonged there as perfectly as family in a photograph. A man and a woman, moving through the kitchen with the ease of long familiarity. Two daughters, the same age, mirroring each other the way twins sometimes do. They prepared meals, folded laundry, drifted from room to room with a quiet domestic rhythm. Not lurking, not searching, living. The name that surfaced through property records, old neighbors, the archive of small-town memory, was Morrison. Robert and Susan Morrison. Twin girls. A family who, according to the official timeline, died in a car crash decades earlier. Their story should have ended in 1987, sealed in obituary ink and family grief. But on those nights, the Mauritians appeared not as haunting silhouettes, but as ordinary people in the middle of their day. And more unsettling still, they seemed to be aging. Not frozen in the year they were lost, but moving forward along their own invisible calendar. Grey hair, adult daughters returning with children, a lineage continuing in a parallel line as if tragedy had missed its mark. Researchers arrived the way they do when something is both impossible and recorded. Instruments, notebooks, theories like nets cast into dark water. A physicist from Oregon State University, Dr. Elena Vasquez, began describing the episodes with careful language, periods of overlap, a kind of dimensional bleeding. The word bleeding carried the right tone, messy, involuntary, the barrier between worlds not cleanly cut, but torn. During these overlaps, Mark and Linda reported the house behaving strangely around them. Sudden cold patches, electronics failing without reason. The unshakable sensation of being watched, not in a supernatural way, but in the way you feel when someone stands just behind a curtain. In the footage, two families occupied the same rooms, the same hallways, as if reality had layered them like transparencies. Yet neither seemed able to see the other. Two lives sharing coordinates, separated by a thin, stubborn membrane. The obvious question, why this house, why this street, leads to a second, more human one. What does trauma do to a place? There is a kind of scar tissue that forms around grief. Families feel it, towns feel it, and perhaps in ways we don't understand, the universe does too. If tragedy splits a life into what happened and what might have happened, maybe the split isn't only emotional, maybe it's structural. Maybe somewhere the alternative keeps going. If the Mauritians are alive in another thread of reality, then the Jamesons' house is not merely haunted, it's shared. It's a border town between outcomes, a reminder that what we call the past might not be finished everywhere. And if that is true, if a family can continue behind the wallpaper of our world, then every home carries a question we seldom ask. How many lives could have unfolded in the same rooms we stand in now? And how close are we, really, to the versions of ourselves that never had to leave? What if you met yourself and realized you were the stranger? The Olympic National Forest can feel like an older world, one that never signed the contract of modern certainty. The trees are so tall, they seem less like organisms and more like architecture, pillars holding up a ceiling of mist. Sound travels strangely there. A footstep can vanish into moss. A bird call can hang in the air like a question. It was on a trail near the Ho River that Daniel Avery first noticed the silence. He wasn't alone, not technically. His hiking partner, Mia, was a few yards behind, pausing to take photos of the ferns. But the forest itself had gone quiet, the way it does when weather is about to change, or when something is listening. Daniel rounded a bend and stopped. A man stood in the middle of the path. Same height, same build, same dark hair that refused to lie flat. Same scar along the jawline from a childhood accident Daniel barely remembered until he saw it mirrored back at him like a signature. The man looked up and met Daniel's eyes without surprise. For a few seconds, neither moved. In a different setting, it might have been funny, like a prank with a skilled actor. But out here, miles from the trailhead, the encounter felt too precise, too intimate. Daniel's throat tightened. His mind reached for explanations the way hands reach for railings in the dark. "Daniel," the man said. Daniel's knees weakened. Only a handful of people used his full name like that. Mia stepped into view behind him, saw the stranger, and froze. Her camera lowered slowly as if gravity had changed. The man's clothes were wrong. Not wrong for the forest, but wrong for this moment. His jacket was the kind Daniel remembered from a brand that stopped making that style years ago. His boots looked worn in a pattern Daniel recognized, the slight outward roll from an old ankle injury. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the smallest difference, like the same song played in another key. "You need to turn back," the man said. "Not later. Now." Daniel's mind tried to reject the sentence on principle. Turn back from what? From a storm? From a bear? But the man's urgency wasn't the theatrical panic of fear. It was steadier, like someone warning you about a bridge they've already watched collapse. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, though the question felt almost absurd. He knew. He didn't want to know. The man hesitated, then took a step forward. The forest seemed to hold its breath. "I'm you," he said quietly. "Just not from here." Mia's hand found Daniel's sleeve. Her fingers trembled. "This is insane," she whispered, but she didn't sound certain. She sounded like someone watching the rules melt. Later, when Daniel tried to reconstruct the encounter, the details would blur in strange ways. He remembered the man's eyes most vividly. His own eyes, but older somehow, as if the light behind them had been burned down by years of decisions. He remembered a phrase the man repeated twice. "It's not a dream. Don't let yourself explain it away." And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the man seemed to step sideways, not left or right, but into the air itself. There was no flash, no smoke, just a faint distortion, like heat above pavement. And then the trail was empty again. For several minutes, Daniel and Mia didn't speak. They stood among the trees with the uncomfortable feeling that the forest had briefly shown them something it usually keeps hidden. When they finally moved, they did exactly what the stranger had told them to do. They turned back. It would have been easy to end the story there. An eerie encounter, a good campfire tale. But the next part is what made it difficult to dismiss. 2 miles down the trail, they found fresh debris from a fallen tree that hadn't been there on the way in. It had crushed part of the path, snapped branches like bones. Mia pointed to the splintered trunk and said nothing, but the question hung between them. Would it have fallen while they were ahead of it? Would Daniel have been under it? Back in town, Daniel went through old journals, searching for any sign he had written about a dream, a feeling, a premonition. He found nothing. But what he did find was a page from years earlier where he had scribbled a line after a near-miss car accident. "Sometimes I think I died and didn't notice." The encounter in the forest, if it was real, suggested something even stranger, that there might be branches of existence where Daniel had not turned back, where the tree fell differently, where Mia walked alone out of the woods, where grief hardened into another version of Daniel with older eyes. Scientists have a word for the idea that all possible outcomes exist somewhere, a multiverse, branching realities like a tree. But words don't capture what it feels like to meet the cost of an alternate choice face to face. What do you say to yourself when you realize your life might be one of many versions, separated not by distance, but by a thin turn in the path? And if another Daniel could cross into this trail for a moment, warning, pleading, what does that mean about the boundary between worlds? Maybe it's not a wall. Maybe it's a footstep away. What if a city had 2 histories and sometimes chose the wrong one? Prague is a city that already feels like it has layers. Gothic spires and Baroque domes sit above tram lines and espresso bars. Cobblestones that have known empires carry tourists clutching smartphones. Time there doesn't move in a straight line. It spirals, which is why, when a few visitors described stepping into a street that shouldn't exist anymore, locals didn't laugh right away. They listened first. Prague has taught people to take strange stories seriously, at least long enough to see whether they hold weight. It happened most often near the Old Town, where alleyways thread between buildings like veins. One couple, Americans on their anniversary trip, recalled taking a shortcut to escape a sudden rain. They ducked under an archway and emerged not into a modern courtyard, but into something that felt uncannily intact from another century. The air smelled different, not just damp stone, but smoke, wood smoke, and oil lamps. The light had a softer quality, as if filtered through soot. The street was narrower than it should have been, lined with timbered facades and rough plaster. Signs hung from wrought iron, painted with symbols instead of words. A horse clopped past, pulling a cart. The people wore clothing that did not look like costumes. Their faces, the couple said, weren't trying to perform an era. They were simply living inside it. What makes a story like this difficult is not the scene itself. Cities stage history all the time. It's the emotional texture, The couple described a disorienting certainty, the sense that they weren't watching a reenactment, but trespassing into a functioning world. They stayed, by instinct or curiosity, for maybe 5 minutes. Then the rain stopped. They turned back through the archway, and the archway was gone. Not physically erased, Prague does not rearrange its masonry overnight, but the passage they had used was no longer an opening. It was a solid wall. They ran their hands along it, feeling only cold stone and confusion. They walked the block twice, then 3 times. No doorway, no arch, no threshold, back to whatever they had stepped into. When they later told the story, it was met with the full range of human defenses: skepticism, laughter, polite discomfort. But then more accounts surfaced, independent and oddly consistent. A student who swore she wandered into a medieval market near dusk and returned with coins she couldn't identify. A businessman who stepped out of a bar and found himself in a street where the buildings were shorter and the language sounded older in his ears, like Czech wrapped in a different mouth. In one case, a tourist claimed he took a photo during the episode and later discovered the image had been corrupted, except for a single strip, a smear of amber light showing silhouettes that didn't match modern clothing. A historian at Charles University, Dr. Pavel Horak, became intrigued not by the sensational angle, but by the pattern. He compared reported locations with old maps, especially those of districts destroyed by fires, wars, and redevelopment. Many of the slip sites aligned with older street grids, paths that had existed, then vanished under later construction. It raised a haunting question. Can a city's former structure persist in some hidden layer, like a fossil embedded in time? Prague has been rebuilt many times. It has been occupied, liberated, renamed, reshaped. Every rebuilding creates an alternate version of what might have remained. And perhaps in the right conditions, rainlight, dusk, a tired mind, an electromagnetic quirk, those versions become briefly accessible. But to treat the phenomenon as only a trick of place would miss the deeper human part, why people kept walking into it. The accounts share a common emotional pulse. People described feeling not fear, but awe, a sense of humility, as if they had brushed against the weight of lives that were not abstractions in a textbook, but breathing bodies in motion. They spoke of seeing children running, vendors shouting, lovers arguing, a full chorus of ordinary humanity, simply arranged in a different time. In that brief overlap, history wasn't a story, it was a room. And when they returned, when the modern street snapped back like a rubber band, what lingered wasn't the thrill of a weird experience. It was grief. The grief of realizing how much of human life disappears, how many days and faces are lost behind us, and how close they might still be. If Prague can sometimes reveal an older self, then maybe time isn't a hallway we walk down. Maybe it's a stack of rooms, and occasionally a door opens where we weren't expecting one, which leads to a quieter, more intimate question. If a city can have 2 histories at once, how many versions of your own life are still standing somewhere, busy, ordinary, and just out of reach? What if gravity wasn't a law, just a local habit? There are places on Earth where people drive for hours to see a hill that seems to run uphill, a roadside mystery, a tourist stop with painted arrows and bored laughter. You park your car, put it in neutral, and watch it roll the wrong way. Most of these spots have an explanation: optical illusion, slanted terrain, a missing horizon line. The brain, desperate for a reference, invents one. It's a lesson in how easily perception can be fooled. But in the Rocky Mountains, near a stretch of wilderness that feels too quiet even for the high country, There's an anomaly that refuses the usual answers. Locals call it the tilt. It isn't marked on maps. It has no gift shop, no roadside sign. People who know about it tend to mention it the way you mention a family secret, with reluctance, and only to those who seem capable of holding it without turning it into a spectacle. The tilt is a shallow valley bordered by granite outcrops and wind-stunted pines. From a distance, it looks ordinary, but once you step inside a certain boundary, an invisible line that hikers describe as walking through a curtain, the body begins to disagree with itself. A rock tossed into the air doesn't arc as it should. It rises, slows, and falls, but the fall feels wrong, like a story told with a missing beat. Water poured from a bottle seems to hesitate. A compass needle flutters. People report feeling lighter, then suddenly heavy again, as if the world is adjusting its grip. In the late 1990s, a small group of geophysicists and curious engineers began visiting the site after a series of mountaineering reports reached the wrong ears. They brought instruments instead of folklore. Accelerometers, laser levels, gyroscopes, the kind of tools built for a world that behaves. What they recorded wasn't enough to rewrite physics, but it was enough to make them quiet. In certain pockets, small, shifting zones within the valley, objects experienced a measurable deviation in gravitational pull. Not dramatic levitation, not cartoon physics, just a subtle but consistent drift, as if gravity's vector had been nudged a few degrees sideways. Like a river current that normally runs straight but suddenly bends around a stone you can't see. The team tried to map the effect. The zones didn't stay fixed. They moved with weather patterns, with solar activity, with something they couldn't name. Some days, the tilt felt normal. Other days, it felt like walking through a place where the Earth had forgotten its own rules. The human accounts are what give the tilt its strange tenderness. A veteran climber described setting his backpack down and watching it slide gently uphill as if it were seeking a different resting place. A biologist reported birds avoiding the center of the valley, skirting it in wide arcs as if instinct recognized an invisible hazard. Another visitor said her anxiety vanished the moment she crossed the boundary, like someone had turned down the volume of her nervous system, then returned sharply when she stepped out again. If this were only geology, we might explain it in terms of density anomalies, unusual concentrations of ore, subterranean structures, magnetic interference. But those explanations don't account for the shifting pockets, the emotional effects, the way electronics sometimes fail in clusters, the way footsteps sometimes sound delayed, as if the echo arrives from a slightly different place than it should. One researcher suggested a bolder idea, not that gravity is breaking, but that the valley is brushing against a region where space-time is configured differently, a neighboring reality with a slightly altered gravitational constant, or a subtle warp in the geometry that defines down. If two such regions overlapped, even briefly, the result could look like a local malfunction in a universal law. In other words, the tilt might not be a violation. It might be a boundary. There is something unsettling about that thought, because gravity is more than a force. It is one of the invisible promises that make life coherent. It keeps oceans in basins and feet on sidewalks. It turns chaos into orbit. If that promise can wobble, even slightly, then what else depends on conditions we mistake for absolutes? Yet standing in the tilt, people often report not terror, but a strange calm. The kind of calm that comes when you realize the world is larger than your assumptions. When certainty loosens, curiosity has room to breathe. Maybe that's why the place remains mostly unadvertised. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's intimate. It challenges you without yelling. It asks you to consider something quietly radical, that the universe might contain more than one set of rules, and our experience is only one local addition. If gravity can tilt, if down can be negotiable, then what does that say about the rest of reality's architecture? And if there are other places where the laws bend, how many of them have we already walked through, explaining away the feeling as tiredness or stress or imagination? Perhaps the strangest part isn't that the world can misbehave. It's that we've trained ourselves to stop noticing when it does. What if coincidence wasn't random, just a signal you don't know how to read? In the desert outside Las Vegas, there is a place where chance seems to repeat itself with unnerving elegance. The locals call it the Loop. It isn't a single building or a secret base. It's a rough patch of land near an old service road, surrounded by sun-bleached scrub and distant mountain ridges. The sky there feels too large, the horizon too confident. It should be the perfect place for randomness, empty, indifferent, unpatterned. But people who spend time near the Loop begin to notice something that is hard to describe without sounding unhinged. The same license plate appears again and again, separated by hours or days, in different contexts that shouldn't connect. A phrase spoken by a stranger is echoed moments later by a radio host. A song lyric you've never heard becomes the next sentence on a billboard. You buy a bottle of water, and the cashier gives you a receipt stamped with a number that matches the last 4 digits of your childhood phone number, something you haven't thought about in decades. At first, it feels like the human brain doing what it always does, hunting patterns for survival. We are meaning-making machines. We find faces in clouds and messages in static. But at the Loop, the coincidences pile up in a way that becomes heavy. They stop feeling like isolated sparks and start feeling like a fire that won't go out. A retired statistician named Harold Quinn was the first to document it methodically. He wasn't chasing the mystical, he was chasing the math. Quinn began visiting the Loop with notebooks, recording every odd event, then running probability analyses back home. He tracked repetitions, clusters, and sequences. He compared what happened there to control sites nearby, similar deserts with similar traffic. The difference wasn't that coincidences existed. Coincidences happen everywhere. It was their density and their structure. In Quinn's logs, patterns formed that were statistically unlikely if events were truly independent. Certain numbers appeared in clusters far beyond expectation. Certain words recurred in short windows, as if language itself were looping. And the most unsettling detail, the loops seemed responsive to attention. The more Quinn focused on a specific pattern, the more it appeared, as if his awareness was tugging on the fabric of probability. This is where the story becomes delicate, because the moment you suggest that observation affects reality, you sound like you're borrowing from physics and turning it into poetry. Yet in quantum experiments, observation does play a strange role. Not human consciousness in a mystical sense, but measurement interaction changes outcomes. Reality at that scale behaves less like a solid object and more like a field of possibilities that becomes definite only when forced to choose. The Loop feels like that principle writ large, not proof, not a clean extension of laboratory rules, but an echo of the idea that the world might not be fully decided until it's touched. Visitors describe a specific sensation in the Loop, a pressure behind the eyes, like being watched by the day itself. Some report time distortions, minutes stretching, hours collapsing. Others describe emotional effects, Déjà vu so strong it becomes nausea. A sense that they are in the middle of a story they can't remember reading. One woman, a nurse traveling through Nevada for a temporary job, told researchers she kept seeing the same man in a red hat, first at a gas station, then at a crosswalk in town, then in the mirror of her car behind her, though no one should have been there. She began to doubt herself until she took a photo at the third sighting. When she looked at it later, the man's face was blurred, as if the camera couldn't decide what it was seeing. Another visitor, an amateur magician, said the loop felt like a stage where the universe was practicing sleight of hand. "It's not trying to scare you," he said. "It's trying to show you that you don't know the trick." There are two ways to interpret a place like this. One is psychological: stress, expectation, suggestion, the brain magnifying the ordinary. The other is structural: that the loop sits in a region where multiple probability streams overlap, and what we call chance becomes less like noise and more like interference patterns. Imagine two radio stations bleeding into each other. Most of the time, you hear one clearly, but in certain conditions, at certain frequencies, in certain locations, the signals cross, creating echoes and repetitions. You might hear the same phrase twice, not because the DJ repeated it, but because the air itself is carrying more than one broadcast. If reality contains parallel timelines, outcomes branching like rivers, then perhaps the loop is a shallow place where those rivers run close enough to mingle. And coincidence, in that context, is not the universe winking at you. It's evidence of overlap. Two similar events from two near-identical worlds arriving in the same moment. The human instinct, when faced with repetition, is to assign meaning, to believe it's a warning or a message or destiny tapping on the shoulder. But maybe the meaning is simpler and more profound, that life is not as singular as it feels. Maybe the loop doesn't predict the future. Maybe it reveals the nearby versions of it. And if that's true, then the biggest question isn't why the coincidences happen. It's why we're so shaken when we realize the world might be doing what it has always done, quietly, invisibly, while we mistook it for randomness. If the universe repeats itself, even briefly, what is it trying to stabilize? And what happens when the repetition breaks? What if a building could learn you, then quietly change to match? In Chicago, there is a warehouse district where the river smells faintly metallic in summer, and the wind off the lake makes even bright afternoons feel sharpened. New tech offices have moved into old brick shells, turning labor into laptops, soot into polished concrete. It's the kind of neighborhood that sells reinvention as a lifestyle, and in the middle of it stands a building locals refer to as the breather. From the outside, it is unremarkable, a converted factory with tall windows and a black steel fire escape. No gargoyles, no strange angles, no dramatic modernist arrogance. It looks like a place that would host startups, art studios, maybe a yoga space with exposed beams. Inside, the first thing visitors notice is the air. Not temperature, not humidity, something more intimate. The way the atmosphere seems to adjust itself around you as you walk. A corridor that feels narrow when you're anxious, wider when you're calm. A stairwell where the echoes of footsteps sound different depending on who is climbing. Rooms that carry a faint scent, citrus, smoke, clean linen, that seems to match whatever memory you're trying not to think about. Most people chalk it up to suggestion. Old buildings have quirks, drafts, pipes, acoustics, hidden vents. The mind stitches those into patterns, especially when you're primed to look. But the tenants of the breather started comparing notes. A graphic designer on the third floor said her studio door shifted position by a few inches overnight, enough that the hinge marks didn't align. A sound engineer reported that the shape of his room's corners seemed to soften over weeks, as if the walls were rounding themselves. A maintenance worker found vents where no vents had been on the blueprint, and when he cut into one section of drywall, he discovered not insulation, but an empty cavity that seemed to extend farther than the building's dimensions allowed. The strangest accounts came from people who lived in the building's newly renovated lofts. They described waking in the night to a slow, subtle rhythm, a deep, settling sound, followed by a faint exhale through the vents. Like the building wasn't creaking, like it was breathing. One tenant, an architect named Simone Patel, was trained to see structures as conversations between material and force. She had renovated enough old spaces to know the difference between normal settling and something else. She began placing small markers on the walls, pencil lines, tape, lasers on tripods to track movement. Her measurements were modest, millimeters, fractions, but they weren't random. The shifts happened in patterns, waves that spread through floors like a pulse. And the patterns changed depending on occupancy. When the building was crowded, certain walls moved outward slightly, corridors widening as if accommodating the flow. When it was empty, the interior seemed to tighten, as if conserving itself. Simone's first instinct was structural stress, temperature expansion, moisture. Yet the timing didn't match. Neither did the direction. It was as if the building was responding to presence, not weather. A small research team from a nearby university, drawn by rumors and Simone's data, installed sensors, vibration monitors, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field readers. What they found was not a single smoking gun, but a constellation of anomalies, fluctuations in EM fields in interior zones without wiring, temperature gradients with no corresponding heat source, low-frequency vibrations consistent with something moving very slowly, continuously, like tissue. That comparison, tissue, was the one nobody wanted to say out loud, because if the building behaved like something alive, then the line between engineered object and organism had been crossed. There was an older theory, half scientific and half mythic, that Simone remembered from architecture school. The idea that spaces shape people and people shape spaces in return. Not just socially, but physically. The way a frequently used stair develops a concave dip, or a banister becomes polished by years of hands. The breather felt like that principle accelerated beyond reason, as if the building was not merely worn by life, but trained by it, as if it had a nervous system made of beams and conduit, learning its occupants the way skin learns sun. One night, Simone stayed late alone, sitting on the concrete floor with the lights off. The building hummed softly around her. She tried an experiment. She focused on a single childhood memory, standing in a hospital hallway, listening to distant footsteps, waiting for news. As the memory sharpened, the air in the loft seemed to cool, and the distant sounds of the building shifted, becoming more echoing, more hollow. It was impossible to prove cause and effect in that moment, but it felt like a conversation. If reality can overlap, then perhaps the breather isn't evolving on its own. Perhaps it sits in a seam where matter behaves differently, where the boundary between mind and environment is thinner, a neighboring dimension where structure is more plastic, more responsive, where intention leaves a stronger imprint. Or perhaps the building is a mirror, and we are the ones changing, our senses tuning to subtleties we normally filter out. Either way, the breather leaves you with a disquieting thought when you step outside into the ordinary city air. If a building can seem to breathe, what else around us might be responding quietly to our presence? And if the world is more alive than we admit, what responsibility do we have for the shapes we leave behind. What if your thoughts weren't private? Because the world could feel them too. In a lab outside Boston, the lights are always a little too bright. The floors are polished to a shine that makes every footstep sound like a decision. On the doors, warnings are printed in neat fonts. Authorized personnel only. Electromagnetic shielding. No personal electronics beyond this point. The project didn't begin with a search for the paranormal. It began with a practical question. Can we measure the body's invisible forces, electrical, magnetic, thermal, in ways that help medicine? The early experiments were straightforward. Volunteers sat in a chair, surrounded by sensors. Electrodes tracked heart rhythms. Coils measured tiny magnetic fields generated by muscle and nerve activity. Cameras mapped skin temperature. Nothing mystical, just physiology made visible. And then, during one late-night session, something happened that didn't belong in the neat world of data. A volunteer, an Iraq War veteran named Chris, was asked to recall a memory that reliably triggered stress. The researchers expected to see what they always saw: pulse rising, skin cooling at the fingertips, subtle changes in breathing. They did see those things, but they also saw something else. A magnetic sensor spiked, not by a tiny fraction, but by a clear, repeatable surge that aligned with Chris's emotional crescendo. And it wasn't localized to his body. It appeared in the room's field readings, as if the air itself had been briefly altered. The team assumed equipment error. They recalibrated, reran the session, swapped sensors. The spike returned. Not random, not constant, but synchronized to the volunteers' internal state. Over the next weeks, they tried new participants. The effect did not appear in everyone, but in a subset, people with intense emotional responses, especially those with trauma histories, the room sometimes behaved as if it were listening. Sensors registered anomalies when fear peaked, when grief rose, when anger surged. The strangest part was how the readings sometimes occurred a second before the participant reported feeling the emotion, as if the environment sensed the shift earlier than conscious awareness. To keep the project from collapsing under skepticism, the lead researcher, Dr. Aisha Renner, insisted on ruthless controls, double-blind protocols, Faraday shielding, noise isolation. They looked for mundane causes: HVAC cycles, electrical interference, magnetic contamination in the building. The anomalies diminished with stronger shielding, but they didn't vanish. Eventually, they built a smaller chamber within the lab, a room inside a room, designed to separate the participant from the surrounding environment as thoroughly as possible. They called it the quiet box. Inside the quiet box, the phenomenon sharpened, not dramatically, not like Hollywood telekinesis, but unmistakably. The room's field readings subtly shifted during emotional peaks, as if intense feeling was producing a measurable perturbation in space. One volunteer described it in a way that made the technicians uncomfortable. "It feels like the room is reacting to me." Dr. Renner did not like that language. Reacting implied intention. She preferred coupled, a neutral word borrowed from physics. The participants' internal state appeared coupled to the ambient field measurements in ways they couldn't fully explain. It forced a question that sits at the edge of both science and philosophy. What is an emotion? We treat emotion as an internal experience, a private weather system of the mind. But emotions are also physical: hormones, nerve signals, muscle tension, heat, breath. If enough of those signals synchronize, if the body becomes a coherent orchestra, perhaps it produces an external signature, a field strong enough to brush the environment. Or perhaps something deeper was happening. something that made the lab feel less like a sealed box and more like a membrane. One theorist consulted by the team proposed an idea that sounded wild but had a strange elegance. In certain conditions, consciousness might act like a boundary condition on reality. Not a magical force, but a kind of organizing principle, something that shapes probabilities, nudges patterns, selects outcomes. If reality is layered, if other versions are nearby, then emotion, especially intense emotion, might act like pressure on the barrier, making overlap more likely. The lab had its own small overlaps. Instruments malfunctioned in clusters. A clock in the quiet box ran fast during one volunteer session, then corrected itself later. A technician reported hearing a faint voice through the intercom during a test when no one was speaking, like a whisper caught between channels. The team refused to call it evidence of another dimension, but in private, several admitted the same uncomfortable feeling, that they were studying not only bodies, but the porous edge between mind and world. For Chris, the veteran, the experience became personal. He said that when he felt fear in the quiet box, it didn't just live inside him. It seemed to spill. He described it like fog leaving his skin and filling the room. When he felt calm, the sensors quieted. The air felt lighter, as if the room itself exhaled. Dr. Renner, who had spent her life trained to distrust anything that smelled like mysticism, found herself haunted by a different kind of awe. Not the awe of supernatural power, but the awe of connection. The possibility that we are less isolated than we think, that our inner lives might leave traces in the world, however faint, however subtle. If emotion can couple to the environment, then privacy is not only a social construct, it's a physical question. What parts of us leak into the space around us? What ripples do we create without noticing? And if the boundary between mind and matter can thin under pressure, what happens in places where thousands of people gather, stadiums, churches, protests, hospitals? Does collective emotion alter reality in ways we haven't learned to measure? Maybe the most unsettling idea isn't that thoughts can move objects. Maybe it's that we've been moving the world all along, gently, without realizing it, and the instruments are only now learning how to listen. What if a town could slip sideways and take you with it? Northern Minnesota is the kind of place where distance has a sound. Wind moving through pine needles, snow settling on roofs, the low groan of lake ice shifting in the dark. Towns there are stitched together by long roads and shared history, and if you grow up in one, you carry its map in your body. You know the shortcut behind the school, the diner that stays open late, the hardware store where the floorboards creak in the same 3 spots, which is why the people of Greybridge noticed when their map stopped matching their feet. It started as small complaints at the coffee counter. Someone swore the pharmacy had been on the corner of Main and Birch, not 2 blocks down. Someone else insisted the old movie theater had never had a second story. A teenager said he walked home from practice and ended up on a street he didn't recognize, even though he'd lived there his whole life. At first, it sounded like ordinary human error, memory softening, attention drifting. But then the stories began to align, not identical, but rhyming. A mail carrier named Janice Keene was the first person to keep records. She had a practical mind and a route that demanded precision. When you deliver mail, you learn houses like faces. You notice when a porch gets repainted, when a dog disappears, when someone's curtains change. Janice began writing down what felt wrong. On certain days, often after heavy fog or the kind of low-pressure weather that makes the air feel thick, Greybridge would present an alternate arrangement of itself, Streets would seem to shift just enough to confuse even the locals. A row of houses might appear older, their siding darker, their windows smaller. A storefront sign would read a different name, painted in an older style. A vacant lot would hold a building that no longer existed in the town's official history. Janice described it like driving through a film set built from your own memory, except the details were too grounded, too lived in. Cars parked at the curb weren't antiques for show. Their paint was chipped, their tires worn. People moved on the sidewalks with the unself-conscious rhythm of belonging. They didn't stare, they didn't gape, they simply lived inside a grey bridge that wasn't quite this one. The town's mayor called it mass confusion and urged residents to avoid spreading rumors. A local pastor framed it as spiritual disorientation, a call to grounding and prayer. Teenagers turned it into dares. Walk down River Street at dawn and see if you can find the old bridge that burned down in 1974. Then someone did find it. A volunteer firefighter named Lewis Hart took the dare after a long night shift. He drove out early, expecting nothing but mist and embarrassment. Instead, he came upon a bridge spanning the river exactly where the burned one used to be. A wooden structure with a narrow lane, its planks wet with fog. He stopped the truck, got out, and walked onto it. The wood creaked under his boots, honest and physical. Halfway across, he heard a vehicle approaching from the other side, a battered pickup with a dented fender. The driver slowed, rolled down the window, and nodded at Louis with casual irritation, as if Louis were the one behaving strangely by standing in the middle of the road. Louis stepped aside. The truck passed. On the door, in faded lettering, was a logo from a business that had closed decades earlier. Louis reached the far bank and turned around. The bridge was gone. Not collapsed, not dissolving in mist. Gone as if it had never been built. He stood on wet grass, staring at open river water where wood had been seconds ago. His truck was still parked behind him on the near bank. The fog still lay thick. But the world had corrected itself, and Louis was left holding a memory that felt heavier than belief. When he told the story, he expected ridicule. Instead, he was met with a surprising hush. Others had seen it too, they admitted. Different streets, different buildings, different versions of the same town. Some had been inside them. A woman named Marlene said she went into the grocery store one afternoon and found it arranged differently. Wooden shelves instead of modern aisles, prices written in chalk. A cashier who called her "Mom" in a tone that sounded like another decade. She paid for her items, and the receipt she received was printed on thin paper with a store name she didn't recognize. When she got home, the receipt had faded until it was almost blank, like an image refusing to stay in our timeline. A small group of curious locals began comparing the alternate details to old archives. What they found was unsettling. The other grey bridge wasn't random. It seemed to match a plausible version of the town, streets aligned with older planning proposals, businesses corresponding to enterprises that could have survived if a flood hadn't happened, or if a highway hadn't been built, or if a fire had been contained. It was as if Greybridge had more than one history stored inside it, like layers of paint beneath a wall, and on certain days, those layers rose to the surface. The simplest explanation is psychological: shared suggestion, memory error, stress. But the consistency, the objects, the receipts, the bridge beneath Louis's boots makes that simplicity feel incomplete. If reality can overlap, then perhaps towns like Greybridge are thin places not because of magic, but because of probability. Small decisions, close calls, near misses. The kind of branching that happens quietly, without fanfare, turning one town into several possible towns existing side by side. And if a place can carry its alternate selves within it, then the question becomes personal. How many of your own alternate streets are still out there? Roads you didn't take, bridges you didn't cross, standing somewhere, solid and wet with fog. And if you ever step into them, even briefly, will you recognize your life there as yours? Or will it feel like a home you almost had, waiting patiently for you to return? What if the sky remembered a different set of constellations? Out at sea, far from city glow, the night sky is not a backdrop, it's a presence. Stars don't twinkle politely, they burn. The Milky Way becomes a pale river overhead. And if you've spent enough nights on open water, you begin to feel a strange relationship with the heavens. Less like you're looking up at something distant, more like you're under a ceiling that has been there longer than language. That's why sailors notice when the ceiling changes. In 2003, a cargo ship crossing the Pacific logged an event that the crew later struggled to describe without sounding like men who'd been drinking. They weren't. They were working. They were tired, practical, the kind of people who trust instruments and weather maps, not wonder. Around 2:10 a.m., the first mate stepped out onto the deck and paused. The stars looked wrong. Not clouded, not dim, wrong in arrangement. The familiar anchor points, constellations used for casual navigation and comfort, seemed subtly rearranged. Orion's belt was skewed. A cluster near the horizon appeared shifted, as if the entire dome had rotated a few degrees off its normal axis. He called others out. The captain came. 2 deckhands. They stood together in the wind, scanning the sky with the slow dread of people realizing their shared frame of reference is slipping. They checked the compass. They checked GPS. Both were normal. The ocean rolled as it always did. The engine hummed with indifferent reliability. But above them, the stars formed patterns nobody could name. One deckhand swore he saw a constellation he'd never seen before. A long arc of bright points, like a broken necklace. Another pointed at what should have been a familiar star and said it looked doubled, as if 2 lights were occupying nearly the same position. The crew did what humans always do when reality becomes unstable. They tried to make it stable again. They took bearings. They compared the sky to printed charts. They rechecked their position. The charts didn't match. The charts, in that moment, belonged to a different world. The episode lasted about 20 minutes. Then, gradually, the stars seemed to settle, the familiar patterns easing back into place, like a disturbed flock returning to formation. The crew, shaken, returned to their tasks. The logbook entry remained, sparse and almost embarrassed. Sky anomaly. Constellations appear shifted. Instruments normal. Years later, astronomers who heard the story suggested mundane causes: atmospheric refraction, unusual temperature layers, optical effects near the horizon. Those explanations can account for distortion, especially close to the sea. But the crew insisted the change affected the whole sky, not just one section. And more unsettling, similar accounts emerged from different oceans, different years, different observers. A fisherman off the coast of Nova Scotia described seeing stars in unfamiliar shapes after an unusual aurora. A pilot flying a red-eye route over the Atlantic reported a brief moment when the star field appeared misaligned, as if he were looking at a different hemisphere's sky. A group of amateur astronomers in Arizona claimed their telescopes tracked a set of star positions that didn't match expected coordinates, then returned to normal before they could properly log it. In isolation, each account can be explained away. Humans misremember. Weather plays tricks. Fatigue warps perception. But when the stories are placed side by side, they begin to form a different kind of pattern, not in the stars, but in the moments themselves. These events tend to happen during liminal conditions, auroras, storms, magnetic disturbances, unusual solar activity. Times when Earth's electromagnetic environment becomes more turbulent. Times when the boundary between our planet and the wider cosmos is in a way more active. If reality is layered, if parallel versions exist near ours, then a disturbance in the environment might weaken the stability of what we perceive as fixed. The sky, in that case, would not be changing in a literal astronomical sense. Stars do not rearrange themselves in minutes. Instead, our relationship to the sky might be shifting. Our frame might be briefly misaligned with the one we assume we occupy, like a radio dial slipping between stations. In one station, the song is familiar. In another, it's nearly the same, but the melody turns slightly different, the chorus altered by a single note. You don't hear both at once, but for a moment, you catch fragments of the other broadcast, proof that a neighboring world is singing nearby. For sailors, the sky is more than beauty, it's orientation. It's a sense of belonging inside the universe. When that map wavers, it touches something primal, the fear of being lost, not geographically, but existentially. And yet, there is another way to feel it, one that some crew members later described quietly, long after the voyage ended. A kind of awe. If the stars can appear different, even briefly, then maybe the cosmos is not one frozen tableau. Maybe it is a set of possibilities, and our experience is only one version of the sky's story. Perhaps elsewhere, on a neighboring track of reality, people look up at constellations we have never named. Perhaps their myths are drawn from different stars. Perhaps their navigators have learned a different kind of north. What does it mean to realize that even the sky, our oldest map, might not be singular? And if the heavens can slip, what else in our world might be less fixed than we assume? Maybe the most frightening thing isn't that reality can change. Maybe it's that reality can change without announcing itself, quietly overhead, while we stand on a deck and stare up, trying to remember which universe we're in. What if a photograph could carry a wound from another timeline? The first time Mara Jensen saw the image, she laughed. One sharp breath of disbelief, the kind that rises when something is almost funny and almost impossible. It was a family photo, the kind that lives in frames and shoeboxes passed from one generation to the next, like proof that ordinary happiness once existed. 4 people on a beach. A father squinting into sun. A mother holding a towel like a cape. 2 kids mid-run, frozen in the careless joy of summer. But the problem was the background. Behind them, where there should have been only water and sky, there was a structure that didn't belong. A pier maybe, or a narrow bridge, except the angle was wrong, and the shape looked unfamiliar, like architecture from a city Mara had never visited. And on the pier stood something else, a figure, blurred, turned half toward the camera. The figure looked like Mara, not a resemblance in the vague way strangers sometimes resemble us. Not could be. The same face, the same posture, the same small tilt of the head Mara's mother used to tease her about. And the clothes, though indistinct, matched a jacket Mara owned, a jacket she hadn't purchased until the year 2012. The photograph was dated 1996. Mara found it in a box after her father died, while she was sorting through the gentle wreckage of a life. Receipts, letters, small keepsakes that suddenly became artifacts. The photo had been tucked between a postcard and an old motel keychain. It looked normal at first glance. Only when she studied it closely did the world inside it begin to misbehave. She did what any reasonable person would do. She checked the back. She checked other prints from the same roll. She looked for signs of tampering, double exposure, light leaks, chemical defects. She asked her mother if they remembered the day. Her mother did remember. The beach, the cheap cooler, the argument about sunscreen. She even remembered taking the photo, laughing as she tried to catch the kids mid-sprint. "That's impossible," her mother said, when Mara pointed at the pier. "There wasn't anything there." Mara scanned the photo at high resolution, zoomed in until pixels became their own kind of abstract painting. The pier remained. The figure remained. The blur around it looked less like camera shake and more like distortion, like the air itself had been warped in the spot where the stranger stood, the stranger who looked like her. For weeks, Mara tried to file it away as grief-induced fixation, a mind reaching for meaning in the aftermath of loss. But the image wouldn't sit still. Every time she looked at it, she noticed new details. A shadow that didn't match the sun's angle, a faint line in the sky like a tear, the texture of the water in that corner looking subtly different, as if it belonged to a different day entirely. She brought it to a photography expert, then to a digital forensics specialist. The experts were careful, polite, and unsatisfied. They could identify no obvious manipulation. The grain structure was consistent. The paper matched the era. The anomalies did not behave like a simple defect. One specialist said something Mara couldn't forget. "It's like part of the image is from somewhere else." Around the same time, Mara began noticing small inconsistencies in her own memory. Not the ordinary fuzziness of time, but sharp contradictions. She remembered owning a dog as a teenager, a border collie named Finch. She remembered the dog's bark, the feel of its fur. Yet when she asked her mother looked at her as if she'd spoken in another language. There was no dog, no photos, no veterinary bills, nothing. Mara found herself searching the house for evidence, the way you search for a word that's on the tip of your tongue. And then, in another box, she found a dog collar, worn leather, a cracked name tag, Finch. It wasn't proof of a parallel universe. It was something quieter and stranger, proof that her personal history contained artifacts that didn't align cleanly. That's when she started to wonder whether the photograph wasn't an isolated glitch, but a symptom, a bruise on reality. Imagine a timeline splitting, a moment where an outcome branches. In one branch, Mara grows up without a dog. In another, Finch exists and dies and leaves a collar that should not be here. In one branch, the beach behind her family is empty. In another, a pier is built there years earlier for reasons that never happened in our world. If those branches ran close enough, perhaps they could smear together in a single exposure, light capturing not only one version of the scene, but a faint imprint from the neighboring version. Photography is already a kind of time travel. It freezes a moment and carries it forward, long after the bodies inside it have changed. It is the closest thing most of us have to proof that the past was real, which is why a corrupted photograph feels so invasive. It threatens the very idea of evidence. Mara began collecting other impossible images from online forums and obscure archives. A wedding photo where a guest appears twice, separated by a few feet, both faces identical. A street photo in New York where a building appears that should have been demolished years earlier. A childhood snapshot where a person in the background wears a logo that didn't exist yet. Most of these could be explained. Tricks, mistakes, hoaxes, misunderstandings. But some carried the same subtle signature, distortion around the anomaly, as if the camera had captured not a lie, but an overlap. For Mara, the question was no longer, is this real, but what does it mean if it is? If the photograph is a seam where two realities touched, then it suggests the past is not sealed. Not everywhere. It suggests that memory and matter might be more fluid than we want to admit, that our lives could be close to other lives, similar, adjacent, diverging, like paths through a forest that run parallel for miles without ever meeting, until suddenly they do. The image of the figure on the pier haunted Mara most at night. She would stare at the blurred outline and imagine the other Mara, older perhaps, or simply altered by different choices, standing in the same sun, watching the same family, carrying a different life in her bones. Was it a warning? A witness? A coincidence captured by chance? Or was it something even more human? A glimpse of the person you might have been, looking back at you through a thin, accidental window. If a photograph can leak another timeline into ours, then what else in your life has been touched by neighboring possibilities, quietly, without you noticing? And if the past can be porous, how certain are we that the story we remember is the only one that happened? What if sound could open a door you didn't know existed? In the Nevada desert, silence is never complete. Even in the emptiest places, there is wind scraping over rock, insects clicking in the brush, the distant hum of a highway that feels like a memory more than a road. But there are nights when the desert seems to quiet itself, as if it's waiting. That's when the tone begins. People describe it differently. Some call it a hum, others a ringing, others a low, vibrating note that doesn't come through the ears so much as through the bones. It arrives without warning. It lasts anywhere from seconds to minutes. And in rare cases, it is followed by something stranger, a displacement. A man driving alone at 1:30 a.m. on a back road outside Tonopah reported seeing the landscape skip like a film reel jumping a frame. One moment he was passing a familiar cluster of boulders. The next moment, the boulders were gone, and the horizon looked subtly rearranged. His gas gauge had dropped farther than it should have. The radio station had changed to one he couldn't find again. And for the rest of the drive, he felt as if the world had been retuned, shifted half a step off the key he knew. A group of campers experienced the tone while sitting around a fire. They said the sound grew louder until it felt physical, making the air shimmer above the flames. For a few heartbeats, the stars seemed to blur and reform. Then the sound stopped, and the desert returned to itself. But when they checked their phones, the timestamps didn't match. Some devices showed they'd lost 8 minutes. One showed they'd gained 5. The human mind is notoriously unreliable in the dark. Fatigue, fear, and expectation can braid into stories that feel real. But the recurrence of the tone and the way it seems to accompany momentary distortions made a handful of researchers curious. Not government agents, not shadowy operatives, just acoustics engineers, physicists, and a small network of citizen scientists who were tired of the usual categories. They began recording the desert at night, placing microphones and vibration sensors in locations where the tone had been reported. For months, they found nothing but wind and insects. Then, on a night of unusually high geomagnetic activity, the sensors captured it, a low-frequency signal below the range most people consciously hear, pulsing in a pattern that didn't match any known industrial source. It rose, fell, then rose again, an almost musical structure, like a chord being tested. The team cross-referenced the timing with auroral forecasts and solar data. The signal aligned with a burst of electromagnetic disturbance, the kind that can ripple through the ionosphere. The first interpretation was geological. Earth itself sometimes sings. There are natural infrasound phenomena produced by ocean waves, storms, even seismic shifts. Volcanoes can generate low-frequency vibrations. So can tectonic stress. The planet is not silent. It's a resonant body. But the pattern of the desert tone, the reports of displacement, the device inconsistencies suggested something beyond geology, something that felt to the researchers like resonance with a boundary. In physics, resonance is what happens when you push something at the right frequency and it responds dramatically. A singer shattering a glass, a bridge swaying under a rhythmic march. The system doesn't break because the force is huge. It breaks because the timing is perfect. If reality is layered, multiple dimensions, multiple probability tracks, then perhaps the barrier between them has its own resonant frequencies. Perhaps under certain environmental conditions, a low-frequency vibration could shake that barrier, making it thinner, not by tearing it, but by synchronizing with it. In that frame, the desert tone is not a message. It's a key. There was an experiment one engineer attempted quietly, almost reluctantly. He placed vibration generators in a remote location and reproduced the recorded pattern at low amplitude, just enough to mimic the natural signal without turning the desert into a speaker. For most nights, nothing happened. Then, during another geomagnetic spike, he reported seeing a brief visual distortion at the edge of his floodlight's beam, like heat ripples but sharper. His compass needle swung and held for 3 seconds, then snapped back. He shut the equipment down and wrote only one line in his notebook. Something responded. That line is the heartbeat of this entire story. Not proof, not certainty, just the sense of a response. It's tempting to turn the desert tone into a dramatic narrative, secret frequencies, portals, hidden doorways, but the more mature possibility is quieter and more human. That reality might be sensitive, structured, but not rigid. That our world may have edges that can be nudged, like curtains stirred by wind. Sound has always been one of humanity's oldest tools for crossing boundaries. Drums in ceremonies, chanting in temples, singing in grief. We use vibration to shape emotion, to synchronize bodies, to make private feeling communal. Perhaps, in rare conditions, vibration does more than move air. Perhaps it moves the architecture of the world itself. If a tone can coincide with moments of displacement, then the question becomes less about spectacle and more about fragility. How many times have you felt something shift? A sudden déjà vu? A moment of disorientation? A sense of being slightly out of place? And dismissed it as nothing? And if reality has resonant notes, what happens as our world grows louder, full of engines, satellites, signals, constant vibration? Are we accidentally brushing against frequencies that make the seams thinner? Or are the seams thinning on their own, and the world is beginning to hum as it adjusts? Either way, the desert leaves you with a thought that is hard to shake. Maybe the universe has doors we don't see, not because they're hidden, but because we haven't learned the right sound to knock. What if the most convincing proof was the one you could never keep? There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from trying to hold on to the unholdable. Anyone who has tried to describe a dream knows it. The moment you wake, the dream is vivid. Textures, faces, even smells. You can feel its emotional weight in your chest. But as you speak, it dissolves. The details slip away like water through fingers, leaving only fragments that sound thin when spoken aloud. People who experience reality overlaps. Houses that host two families, forests that offer you your own face, towns that rearrange their streets, describe a similar pattern. The event is undeniable while it's happening. And then, afterward, the world conspires to make it feel implausible. Not through malice, through normalcy. Normalcy is powerful. It smooths edges. It closes open doors. It teaches you to doubt anything that doesn't match the agreed-upon map. That's why so many of these stories contain a familiar twist, evidence that fades, a receipt that turns blank, a photo that corrupts, a recording full of static, a time discrepancy that resolves itself the next day, objects that should prove a moment's reality becoming stubbornly ordinary the moment they are scrutinized. In Graybridge, the Minnesota town with two street grids, several residents tried to document the alternate days. They set up cameras on tripods, facing intersections rumored to shift. They recorded hours of nothing. When the shift finally happened, when a different storefront appeared, when an older street lamp cast a warmer light, the cameras failed. Batteries that had been full drained in minutes. Memory cards corrupted. One device recorded only black frames with a faint, rhythmic flicker, like the camera was blinking in confusion. In Salem, Oregon, Mark and Linda attempted to capture the overlap in their house with multiple redundant systems: cloud backups, wired cameras, analog recorders. The footage sometimes survived, but often it didn't. Files vanished. Audio desynced. Timestamps scrambled. The more they tried to trap the phenomenon in technology, the more technology seemed to melt around it. This pattern could be dismissed as human error, poor equipment, bad luck, misinterpretation. But the consistency across unrelated cases suggests something deeper, that overlap events may not be fully compatible with our way of recording. Think about it this way. Every recording device is built on assumptions. The camera assumes light behaves predictably. The microphone assumes sound waves travel through air consistently. The clock assumes time flows at a steady rate. These tools are faithful within the rules they were designed for. But what if an overlap is, by definition, a moment when those rules are unstable? If two realities are briefly superimposed, then light might carry information from more than one source. Timestamps might conflict. Data might be forced into contradictions. Our instruments, built for one timeline, might not know how to store what belongs to two. There is a researcher in Seattle, Dr. Noelle Klein, who studies anomalies in digital recordings, glitches that don't fit typical patterns of corruption. She has an unglamorous job, staring at noise. But noise, she argues, is where the world hides its secrets. Klein has collected recordings from dozens of anomaly cases, strange audio bursts, distorted video frames, timecode irregularities. When she analyzes them, she finds repeating signatures, brief spikes in entropy, patterns that resemble interference between two signals. The data looks like a broadcast caught between stations. Not a clean message, but the trace of overlap. To Klein, the fading evidence isn't proof of deception. It's part of the phenomenon's nature. Like trying to bring a deep-sea creature to the surface, the pressure change itself destroys what you're trying to study. And that, she says, is why the events remain stuck in the borderland between belief and disbelief. Not because they never happen, but because they are hard to translate into the language of proof. This creates a unique human tension. We live in an era that worships documentation. If it's not recorded, it didn't happen. If it can't be shared, it can't be trusted. But reality overlaps, if they exist, may belong to a category of experience that resists capture, like grief or love, or the feeling of standing beneath a sky that makes you feel small. So what are we left with? We are left with witnesses. And witnesses are complicated. They carry bias, they misremember, they embellish. They also tell the truth more often than we admit. Human testimony is not perfect, but it is one of the oldest ways knowledge survives. In many of these cases, the witnesses share a common after effect, not a desire to convince others, but a change in how they live. They become gentler with uncertainty, less eager to mock what they don't understand, more attentive to small shifts, light in a hallway, a phrase that repeats, the feeling of being slightly out of place in your own life. Because once you've experienced something that breaks the usual categories, you can't fully go back. The world remains itself, but your relationship to it changes. Reality becomes less like a wall and more like a surface that can ripple. And in that rippling, a new kind of humility appears. Maybe the universe doesn't owe us proof in a format we prefer. Maybe evidence is not always a photograph or a file, but a pattern that emerges in human lives. Repeated stories, consistent sensations, quiet shifts in worldview. Still, the desire remains. The longing to keep something tangible, to hold the impossible in your hands long enough to show someone else. Which leads to the question that ends this chapter and opens the last. If reality overlaps are real, and if they resist documentation, what are they asking of us? To become better recorders, or to become better listeners? And if the proof keeps fading, is it because the universe is hiding something, or because the truth is too complex to be held still? What if the point was never to prove it, only to be changed by it? By the time you've traveled through all these stories, the world begins to feel slightly different. Not in a dramatic way. Your kitchen still has the same chairs. Your phone still buzzes with the same notifications. The news still moves with the same relentless momentum. But somewhere under the routine, a new awareness settles in, like learning that a familiar song has a hidden harmony, a house in Oregon that sometimes hosts two families, a forest trail where you meet your own face and receive a warning you can't explain, a city that reveals an older street and then closes the door behind you, a valley where gravity tilts, a patch of desert where coincidence clusters like it's being guided, a building that seems to breathe, changing in response to the people inside it, a lab where emotion couples to the environment in measurable ways, a town that occasionally wears its alternate history like a second coat, a night sky that briefly rearranges itself as if our frame of reference slips between broadcasts, a photograph that carries a person who shouldn't be there, a timeline bruise printed on paper, a tone in the desert that feels like a key struck against an invisible lock, evidence that fades, recordings that fail, proof that refuses to stay pinned down. If you listen to these accounts as a skeptic, you find plausible explanations for each one. Optical illusion, faulty memory, psychological priming, equipment error, weather and fatigue and coincidence. The world offers countless ways to misunderstand what we see. If you listen as a believer, you hear a different melody, parallel dimensions leaking into ours, thin places where the barrier weakens, hidden structures in reality revealed by rare conditions. But maybe the most honest position is not at either extreme. Maybe these stories live in the space between, the same space they describe. Because what they really confront is not a technical question about physics. It's a human question about certainty, about how much of life we experience through assumptions we never examine. We are raised to think of reality as a single track, one timeline, one past, one set of rules. We call anything else fantasy. We learn to treat mystery as a problem to solve, a curiosity to pin down. But the older you get, the more you discover that some truths don't arrive as answers. They arrive as expansions. Grief expands you. Love expands you. Seeing the world through the eyes of someone you thought you understood expands you, not by making things simpler, but by making them deeper. What if these leaks are like that? Not proof that the universe is broken, but reminders that it is larger than our models. Reminders that we occupy a narrow band of experience within a much wider spectrum of possibility. Even if every story here had an ordinary explanation, the pattern still matters. People are encountering moments that feel like seams, moments that shake them out of autopilot, moments that make them notice how fragile the sense of normal really is, and notice what these stories do not require. They do not require us to accuse anyone. They do not require us to fear shadowy forces. They do not require us to turn curiosity into ideology. In fact, the healthiest way to hold them is with humility, recognizing that the line between the known and unknown has always been part of being human. There's a reason these stories resonate most with people in midlife and beyond. When you're young, you assume time is abundant and the world is stable enough to map. When you've lived longer, you've watched maps fail. People change, memories shift, technologies reshape your daily life. Certainties you inherited turn out to be provisional. You begin to understand that reality is not just out there, it's also in here, in the way you remember, interpret, and carry your days. In that sense, dimensions can be read two ways. They can be literal, neighboring realities, brushing ours, physics behaving differently at the edges, worlds overlapping like transparent films. Or they can be metaphorical, the many layers of human experience, memory, perception, emotion, history, interacting with the external world in ways we still don't fully understand. A marriage has dimensions. A childhood has dimensions. A trauma has dimensions. A city has dimensions. Even a photograph has dimensions when it holds more than what the camera intended. Maybe the most profound possibility is that both readings are true at once. That the universe is layered, and so are we. That the boundary between outer and inner is thinner than we were taught. If the world sometimes glitches, perhaps it is not because it is malfunctioning, but because it is complex, more complex than the stories we tell ourselves to stay calm. And so the epilogue is not a conclusion. It's a way of living with questions. When you walk into your home tonight, listen to the sound it makes when you close the door. Feel the weight of the floor under your feet. Notice the light on the wall. These things are real. They matter. Reality, even if layered, is still the place where we love, work, forgive, and grow old. But maybe, just maybe, there is also a thinness at the edge of the familiar. A possibility that the world has more rooms than the ones we occupy every day. If you ever feel a moment slip, a coincidence too precise, a street that looks subtly altered, a memory that doesn't fit the official story, don't rush to declare it proof of anything. Don't rush to dismiss it either. Hold it the way you hold a seashell you found at the edge of the tide. You don't need it to prove the ocean exists. The ocean is already there. The shell is simply evidence that you stood close enough to touch what is larger than you. And if reality is, in fact, a shoreline, land and sea, certainty and mystery meeting, then the timeless human question becomes this: Are we brave enough to live with wonder without needing to own it? And if the universe keeps whispering through seams and overlaps, are we willing to listen, not to escape our world, but to understand it more deeply? Because perhaps the greatest leak into our reality is not another dimension. It's the quiet realization that truth is not always a single line. Sometimes it's a widening horizon.